On the 3rd of December 2008, in the ceremonial room of Oslo City Hall, Norway was the first country to sign the treaty to ban cluster munitions. In attendance were diplomats, representatives of non-governmental organizations, and victims of this indiscriminate weapon. Almost exactly 11 years earlier, in the same room in Oslo City Hall, victims of another indiscriminate weapon gathered, along with diplomats and representatives of non-governmental organizations. On the 10th of December 1997, a week after the Ottawa Treaty banning anti-personnel landmine was signed, Tun Chanareth, a landmine victim from Cambodia, received the Nobel Peace Prize on behalf of the international campaign to ban landmines. These two victories against landmines and cluster munitions were achieved thanks to the campaign to ban these weapons led by civil society. Millions of anti-personnel landmines have been laid in areas where civilians live. Used throughout the world in nearly every single conflict since the Second World War, the consequences of these weapons have been catastrophic. Hundreds of thousands of people have been killed or mutilated, devastating families and village communities. Daily life activities such as fetching water or farming land became potentially lethal.
Aí pela campanha lá tem na mata, foram nos buscar, chega no caminho, no coisa, então encontramos a mina que eu pensei.
Aid organizations such as Handicap International first helped victims by setting up artificial limb-fitting workshops and rehabilitation centers. This allows people affected by this weapon to regain independence and rebuild their lives. These activities amongst the affected populations are complemented by demining and mine risk education programs. These activities in affected areas started in the early 1980s, but the risk posed by landmines remains for millions of people who faced and still face this lethal threat every day.
Nós queremos e voltamos no mato, mas problema da estrada, a estrada não está limpa. Problema das minas, ainda não tiraram as minas.
The fight against landmines then moved on to the diplomatic sphere. From 1992, the idea of a total ban appeared. At the beginning, this idea was only supported by a few non-governmental organizations working in the field like Handicap International and human rights groups. The campaign relied heavily on support from the general public. Throughout the world, hundreds of NGOs and millions of citizens rallied together to sign petitions, to challenge their governments to act, and to show their support to victims. There was a real awareness and mobilization of the general public, evident in the dozens of pyramids of shoes that took place throughout Europe. The pyramids were a protest on behalf of all the people killed and wounded by landmines throughout the world.
Je pense à tous ces gosses qu'on voit mutilés. Enfin, bon, dans nos pays, on fabrique ce type de matériel que je trouve absolument scandaleux, enfin, qui ne respecte pas la personne humaine.
Il n'y a rien de plus immonde que les mines antipersonnelles, vu que ça reste après un conflit. Donc même quand les gens ont décidé de se réconcilier, ce qui n'est pas facile, et que tout le monde a fait un geste pour se serrer la main, ça reste.
Young people, both children and teenagers, care about these issues and enter the debate by giving their point of view.
Les mines, c'est des petits objets un peu comme des bombes qui sont sur ou en dessous de la terre et quand quelqu'un marche dessus, ça le tue ou ça le mutile. Et moi je trouve ça vraiment dégoûtant les mines.
Il faudrait convaincre tous les pays à signer le traité et il faudrait que ceux qui signent le traité qui détruisent tout leur stock de mines, qu'ils arrêtent d'en fabriquer et puis que toute la planète soit en paix.
Je crois qu'il y a une part de rébellion importante chez Titov, comme chez les enfants de son âge, qui est de dire c'est pas juste, le monde des adultes nous dirige, et quand on est enfant, à cet âge-là, à 10 ans, on a envie de changer le monde, on croit qu'on peut faire plein de choses, et il y a une part de rébellion. On n'accepte pas forcément le monde tel qu'il est. Et on se dit, bon, ben, je crois que les enfants qui étaient là aujourd'hui, s'ils avaient les moyens financiers, ils prendraient l'avion pour aller exiger les présidents qui signent la charte pour le désarmement. Et je trouve que ça, c'est une force qu'on a à cet âge-là et qui est dommage de perdre plus tard.
Along with Zepp, the creator of the Titov comic strip, Raymond Albrecht is another famous person who brings the weight of his opinion to this campaign. Raymond Albrecht used to be in the French resistance and was in charge of demining activities in France after the war ended.
Dans l'ensemble de la trajectoire de handicap international, ce qui me frappe, c'est que cette organisation non gouvernementale, partie d'un petit noyau d'hommes et de femmes soucieux d'aide humanitaire, est arrivée à mobiliser suffisamment l'opinion en France et dans d'autres pays. Je pense que c'est important de faire comprendre aux jeunes le poids, la force de l'opinion publique quand il s'agit de mobiliser les hommes, les femmes, même les enfants, contre une injustice majeure.
The artistic world also supported the campaign to ban landmines, in particular through the making of Spotlight on a Massacre, a series of 10 short movies shown worldwide.
Iko, mogu bać dve mine ovdje.
Saša, daj mi jednu minu.
Da. Mišo.
Stvarno si kreten.
The high level of public support also legitimated the work of the organizations involved and allowed them to take the debate into international diplomatic circles. After 5 years of campaigning and negotiations, the treaty to ban anti-personnel landmines was finally signed by 122 countries in December 1997 in Ottawa, Canada. A few days later in Oslo, this movement of citizens, the first of its kind, received the Nobel Peace Prize. This victory does not mean the end of the movement. The treaty clearly forbids the use, stockpiling, production and transfer of these weapons. However, the issue of victim assistance, mine risk education and demining are not being sufficiently addressed by signatory countries. Organizations like Handicap International remain mobilized so that the populations affected by these weapons are the real beneficiaries of the treaty. Our commitment to the populations affected by mines made Chris, a deminer and the victim of an anti-personnel landmine, start to run marathons.
I run to raise the issue of anti-personnel mines and also the issue of handicap. I was blown up a year ago. I chose to go and clear landmines for a charity. I was unlucky. There was a mine with a small amount of metal below metal detector range. It was the first mine my deminers had ever missed, and I always said if they miss one, I want to be the first to know about it. And I was, so I can't complain. But many people in mined areas have no choice. I chose to go there. These people have no choice. It's home. I've seen people digging and trying to farm in minefields because they have nowhere else to go. And they say, when you ask them to stop so that we can clear the mines for them, they say, we have no choice. We starve or we dig.
Taking into account the problems faced by populations in conflict areas quickly highlighted another disaster, cluster munitions. Similar to the horror of anti-personnel mines, cluster munitions have been extensively used since the conflicts in South Asia in the mid-1960s. In Laos, for instance, nearly 40 years after the end of the war, children still find these lethal weapons in their playgrounds. Laos is sadly not the only country in the world where civilians have to coexist with these weapons. Afghanistan, Iraq, Lebanon, Kosovo. There are over 30 countries and areas in the world that are contaminated by these remnants of war.
بثنا الحرب أنا صوبت فأمي نامت وياي المستشفى هم من قاموا يذبون عنقودي طيارات لعبوا بالشارع هو وأخوي صغار مني فراح علي عباله فد ميدالية شي ويا مال زي ما طق عليه
يعني هو كان دا يلعب؟
اي دا يلعب اي ايديه انقطمت
ايديه من الرسم؟
ايديه اي منها وقصوه هي منها واصاب عذني اثنين وهذا الاخ انقطمي منها هم عنده بعد عمليه يعني لحد الان احنا صرفنا عندنا وما عندنا حتى اغراض بيتنا بعنا.
Drops from aircraft or launched by artillery, submunitions spread over their military objectives as well as surrounding civilian areas. Used during a war situation, 5 to 30% of submunitions fail to explode on impact, remaining active after the end of the conflict.
Okay, we're dealing with a BLU-97. It's a cluster bomb. It was dropped by NATO forces. What happened because of the condition of this ground, you can see it's pretty soft. You'll probably find that a lot of these cluster bombs didn't detonate on impact of the ground. So this whole area is probably contaminated with unexploded cluster bombs.
What are you going to do now?
Okay, once again we're going to have to destroy this bomblet in situation. The slightest movement of this bomblet could cause it to explode.
Just as with anti-personnel mines, the activities of organizations were not limited to actions on the ground to support the victims. Handicap International started a campaign for the ban of cluster munitions in 2003. So far, 700,000 people have signed its petition against these weapons, which has forced the debate amongst political decision-makers. Negotiations began thanks to the support of countries such as Norway. One of the roles of NGOs during conferences is to put across the rights and opinions of affected populations. The voice of victims is heard during different phases of the process, their testimonies reminding political decision-makers of the human consequences of these weapons. Anonymous statistics are replaced by human faces, in front of which governments must take their decisions. Branislav Kapitanovich was one of those witnesses, an advocate for the victims of cluster munitions having lost both legs and both hands to this weapon. Branislav took part in the entire process that led to the treaty being signed in Oslo in December 2008.
Pa to je izuzetno važno, prvo što sam ja povređen od tog oružja, drugo što znam koliko je to oružje opasno zato što sam radio, a treće zato što sam se toliko borio kroz ovaj proces i svu sam svoju energiju usmerio da dođemo do toga konačnog sporazuma i na kraju smo uspjeli i zbog toga sam jedan od najsrećnijih ljudi, iz tih razloga.
Donc suite à la tragédie libanaise, les bombardements massifs de bombes à sous-munitions sur le sud Liban, eh bien les Norvégiens ont dit stop. Et ils ont lancé ce processus en février 2007, c'était avant-hier. Et ça c'est la magie de la nouvelle diplomatie, cette alliance entre un pays et quelques pays amis déterminés sur un objectif précis. Cette alliance avec une société civile bien organisée, structurée, sur le modèle du traité d'Ottawa.
Well, I think one thing about this campaign is that it's been knowledge-based civil society. It's been a question of not only doing the lobbying in the streets, getting the public mobilization, getting the media on board, and Handicap International and other organizations around the world have been crucial for that sort of political public mobilization, but this knowledge-based civil society of working directly with the diplomats, getting the data, getting the information, being rigorous and putting it down on paper so people can say, well, here's the evidence, we've got to ban these things.
We care, we concern about the real life of the human being. We care about the voiceless of the people who are suffering, who are wounded by cluster munition. For me, always I fix the finger like this. I ask them, please look to me. I injured by anti-personnel landmine. Please look to my friend. They got wounded by cluster bombs. Please ban it, destroy it, don't use it, and looking back to our wounded, give more help, give more support, and give hopes and good future to them.
Every 90 minutes, a person is killed or wounded by a mine or a cluster bomb somewhere in the world. To make sure that those victims are never forgotten, please support Handicap International.